Okay, well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for being with us this morning, bright and early. My name is Rachel Owen. I'm the Director of Missouri Science and Technology Policy Initiative, not to be confused with Missouri Science and Technology University or Missouri University of Science and Technology in Rolla. We're an independent nonprofit based in Jefferson City, and we work broadly across the state to connect science and policy. Our organization's been around since 2016, but this is our first year down at the Capitol. We have 5 legislative fellows who answer questions from lawmakers when things come up related to legislation. And so I just want to give a shout out quick to one of our policy fellows, Dr. Jenny Bratbird. She's our policy fellow who covers transportation, public safety, energy, and environment, and she organized this briefing this morning. A little bit more background. One of the reasons why we want to host these briefings is that we always get questions from lawmakers about what's some of the new research that's being done around the state of Missouri. And so these give us an opportunity to really showcase some of the research that's being done and bring in some different perspectives so that you're not just hearing from me and the fellows. And this morning we decided that a good topic to talk about right now in Missouri, especially after the 2019 floods, is related to flooding in the state and some of the emerging priorities associated with future forecasted flooding. So this morning we have 2 speakers with us. Our first speaker will be Dr. Amanda Cox. Dr. Cox is an associate professor of civil engineering at St. Louis University and is also the director of the Water Center at St. Louis University. And she's going to be presenting on flood forecasts. So Amanda, I'll go ahead and let you share your screen.
Thanks for the introduction. As Rachel mentioned, I'm the director of the Water Institute at St. Louis University, and I really wanted to give a quick plug about that. This is a newly formed institute at St. Louis University, and the word water in our name is an acronym that stands for water access, technology, environment, and resources. The Institute focuses on innovative interdisciplinary research for many of the critical and persistent water-related issues, including things like access to clean water, reducing the impacts of water-related natural disasters, and protecting aquatic ecosystems. We find that these complex issues require a collaborative approach with experts in many fields, including science and engineering, but also policy and economics and public health and social justice. The Water Institute at SLU brings together experts across several fields within the university to help address some of the world's most challenging water-related issues. My presentation today provides an overview of an ongoing collaborative research project to develop a tool to forecast long-term changes in channel morphology. The project is funded by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and the principal investigator for the project is Phil Soar from the University of Portsmouth in the UK. In addition to my work at SLU, we also have team members from the University of Nottingham and Mindrop Engineering. The intent of the project is to develop forecast changes, a tool to forecast changes in river form and river bed material. For example, sand and gravel, or cohesive material are types of riverbed materials. And these materials exist at the channel boundaries. It's important to note that rivers provide several functions, the most basic of which is transporting water and sediment. I'm going to use the term sediment throughout my presentation, and it refers to the earthen materials such as sand and gravels in the river. Rivers also serve as water sources and as mechanisms for transporting bulk material with barges. We find that river systems are part of a larger hydrologic system. This system connects rainfall with surface water runoff and also infiltration to and from groundwater systems. So it's a complex system that it's a larger part of. Rivers are also dynamic, as you can see in the photograph. There are several obvious former channel locations. This site is located on the lower Mississippi River, northwest of Jackson, Mississippi. The rivers also behave with significant complexity, constantly exchanging water and sediment at its boundaries. Rivers can exist in a form of dynamic equilibrium. meaning the river changes gradually over many decades. However, significant disturbances can cause notable changes over just a few decades. Generally speaking, the channel evolves its shape, slope along the flow, and bed and bank materials in order for the energy of the flow to match the strength of the channel boundary and ultimately return to some form of dynamic equilibrium. Both ambient and direct changes can occur that impact this careful balance within the system. Ambient changes include climate change, which can result in either increased or decreased annual flows in rivers, or changes in the variability of flows, maybe more occurrence of larger flows and lower flows as well. Some examples of intrinsic changes include river channelization. This was commonly done in the early 20th century, where the rivers were straightened to allow for faster conveyance of water. Also, other examples include regulating river flow through reservoirs and water diversions. River channels can respond to these types of disturbances in a variety of ways, such as changing the channel size, the slope along the flow path, and the bed and bank materials. These changes occur through sedimentation and erosion processes. Sedimentation occurs when material, like sand and gravel, is deposited in the channel. This means that the river doesn't have enough energy to transport the available sediment in the flow. Conversely, erosion occurs when the channel flow has too much energy relative to the channel material, and the material is eroded away. It's important to note the complexity in how the channel changes shape. It doesn't simply raise or lower an elevation in response to sedimentation or erosion. There are complex lateral adjustments that occur. These types of channel responses can have negative impacts on the system, such as reducing the channel flow capacity, which in turn increases the occurrence of flooding. They can also adversely affect aquatic habitat, such as burying mussels in sediment. Other notable impacts include problems for navigation when the channel becomes too shallow, or other negative impacts on adjacent infrastructure, like water intakes being buried by sediment. There are several existing numerical modeling tools. Remember, the intent of this project is to develop a new tool, and the existing tools generally have the form shown here, where the inputs include the channel geometry and roughness of the channel, the duration and varying flow events, and the channel property materials. The models that are used in the existing tools are process-based and include calculations for hydraulic and sediment transport conditions, both spatially throughout the channel and temporally throughout time. And model results can include parameters such as the depth of flow at different locations along the channel, the areal extents of water inundation. This is something that's important for modeling flood conditions. And also they can predict how the bed will change elevation over time through a simple raising and lowering of the bed. It's important to note that these existing models are deterministic, meaning the models have one solution for a given set of input parameters. So the tool we're developing for this project is called FRAME. This is an acronym that stands for Future River Analysis and Management Evaluation Tool. The tool is capable of long-term forecasting of river channel evolution. It is uncertainty bounded and flexible to explore a range of possible future scenarios. Also, our tool is a hybrid model. It incorporates the traditional process-based hydraulic and sediment transport models, but also includes a set of rules for how the channel responds to imbalances in these sediment transport rates. Finally, the tool will provide a variety of indicators for various channel conditions. We know that some of the model inputs have notable uncertainty. For example, it's difficult to quantify the material of the channel bed and the bank at all the locations in the channel. In fact, it varies across the channel and along the channel. Also, we don't know the exact future sequence of flow rates for the river because that depends on the occurrence of rainfall, which is variable from year to year. So if we feed these variable inputs into the model, this results in a range of output conditions. Say let's focus on the elevation of the channel bed at a given location. After modeling 50 years of flow and channel response, the chart shows the starting point for the model, the model variable of interest, and the range of possible and plausible outcomes for the variable of interest. Existing models currently provide a probable future, which is one answer based on one set of input parameters. So our tool Frame will evaluate various input parameters to determine the set of plausible future conditions. We can use models in various ways, including evaluating an event after it has happened. This we call hindsight. We can use modeling tools to see why an event or condition happened. We can also forecast what might happen based on previous observations. And then finally, we can use a forecasting approach to identify changes that can be made within the river to increase the likelihood of the preferred future alternative. I mentioned our tool is a hybrid model. It incorporates the traditional process-based models that calculate hydraulic and sediment transport conditions. It couples that with a set of rules for how the channel responds to imbalances in sediment transport rates. So existing river modeling tools, as I mentioned, simply raise or lower the channel bed elevation in response to these changes. However, channel response is more complex than this simple adjustment. The channel can also adjust its width in response, so it increase or decrease its width. So our model incorporates rules that specify how the model changes when there's an imbalance between the sediment transport rates in different sections. We're currently using a reach of the lower Mississippi River to develop and test the model. Another feature we've added is how channel responds to dike field installations. So dikes are longitudinal rock structures commonly used along large rivers to make channels deeper for navigation. These structures both erode material from the main channel and capture material in the stagnant flow areas between the dikes. So this is an unusual modification for a channel that's challenging to model with our existing models. This is where the rules-based approach is beneficial, or the hybrid modeling is beneficial for our project. Model results will include parameters such as water depths or the elevation of the water surface and flow velocities. These are all interesting parameters that can inform for factors like flooding or infrastructure stability along the channel. However, we are working to incorporate several indicators derived from the model results. These indicators could be used for land use planning, hazard avoidance and asset management, and conservation management. So just as an example, one of the indicators would be reach habitat type. So it would be an indicator of the suitability of the hydraulic and sediment conditions for different types of aquatic organisms or different habitats. So in summary, Frame will be a new strategic planning tool that can reveal long-term impacts of changing hydroclimate, changing river management practices, changing sediment inputs, and incorporating the epistemic uncertainty in river processes. We're currently using a section of the lower Mississippi River to test and further develop the model. However, I'll note the Mississippi River is a large river. This tool that we're developing will be applicable to rivers of all sizes. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you for the opportunity to present. And I believe there will be an opportunity at the end of both presentations for questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cox. Yes, I think we're going to go ahead and hold questions until the end. But if you have questions, feel free to type them into the Q&A or the chat box to the panelists anytime, and we can work to get those questions answered in the chat box. I'll go ahead now and let Dr. Rogers, if you want to start sharing your screen, I'll go ahead and introduce you. So this morning we also have Dr. Rogers with us. Dr. Rogers is at Missouri University of Science and Technology in Rolla. He's the professor and Karl F. Hasselmann Chair in Geological Engineering, and that's in the Department of Geosciences and Geological and Petroleum Engineering. And this morning he's going to be giving us a presentation on emerging priorities in the wake of increasing flood damage. And we can see your screen, Dr. Rogers. And I will go ahead and unmute you.
There, can you hear me now?
We can hear you.
All right. Well, thank you, Rachel. It's a pleasure to be here, and talk about floods was one of my favorite subjects, and I've spent a lot of time in my career. The title is what our emerging priorities are in the wake of increasing flood damage. This really started with Hurricanes Katrina back in 2005. That's when there was a reevaluation of the status quo that took place. I'm having see. All right. So back in 2011, I was part of a National Academy of Engineering group that was assigned to look at levees in the National Flood Insurance Program, because the program was almost $18 billion in the red. So it wasn't doing well. And you can see here, if you go back to 1900 with constant dollars, we saw a system where it was going along at a pretty steady rate. And then beginning in the 1973 flood, and then the 1993 flood on the lower Missouri, we started seeing these things going up precipitously. The problem with floods and hurricanes is we have more and more people living in harm's way. There's been a huge shift of population towards the coast areas, both the Great Lakes and the East Coast, the Gulf Coast and the Pacific Coast. And that's why we're seeing so much more damage, in part due to these events. The one that occurred with Katrina we had not previously had an event of that magnitude hit New Orleans since 1969, but before that they had a similar size event in 1965. And so depending who you talk to, that was the 5th event that was major damage to New Orleans in 90 years. So just on the surface of it, everybody calling it a 100-year event. It depends how you define and what parameters you're bounding yourself in on that. This actually shows, this is from NOAA, National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, just showing the coastal shoreline county populations continue to rise. We had this little drop right here in 2005, 2006 because of Katrina. And the coastal watershed counties, by now, half the American population lives within 50 miles of the coast in an area comprising just 17% of the country. The biggest thing that our panel started out with General Galloway, was the statement that we all know there's insufficient flood storage area. What happened before the Corps of Engineers got involved with all this with the 1927 flood is you had you had local levee districts that did non-engineered structures, and they basically reclaimed 90% of the floodplain. Like if we look at the Missouri River, for instance, and we never should have let them dike off more than about 75% of the floodplains. We just don't have storage in the floodplain for flood waters when they come. And so the other problem was the complaint that FEMA's National Flood Insurance Program, administered by FEMA, only looks at 100-year flood frequency levees. As soon as you dip to become a 99-year frequency levee, you cannot be in the federal program. And there was a lot of angst about that coming from Congress. This shows myself and General Galloway. It was a pleasure to work with him. His report on the 1992 flood was really the Bible of modern flood engineering for the United States post 1993. Then we were the first NAS panel tasked with evaluating economic aspects of an engineering program. That had never happened before. Usually the National Academies can only talk about science, not talk about policy. We were actually asked by FEMA to say, you know, how should they change their policies, because they're way outside the bounds of bringing in as much money coming in as they have going out. So we were a fast track. Instead of going 3 years, we went a little over 2 years before putting out our report. We traveled all around the country and solicited public input. This is down near Houston, Texas, where you have very flat floodplains, and so you have to do a lot of work to excavate channels. And I saw this channel. They took us out there on a Tuesday afternoon, and the Brazos River's down here at the end of the channel, and this channel's 67 feet deep right here. And the next day they took us out after an average storm, and you can see there's an enormous amount of storage in this channel. It's 7 miles long. It's all man-made. And this is an example of a very well-managed flood control district for a very upscale community with lots of money and good engineering taking place. And that's the exception, not the rule. The other thing that I had input on was the survivability of levees. Why it seems to people like the levees are less survivable to overtopping than they used to be. This is actually showing just north of St. Louis, the Winfield-Pillsbury overtopping in the 2008 Middle Mississippi flood. And when we go out and look at these sites, we can actually use ground-based LiDAR. We can get the water heights from the silt on the tree trunks over here. And it's very, very sandy material because there's the low flow channel of the Mississippi River right next to us. I mean, we got a levee that was piled up here right next to the active channel. So here's where they've diked off even more than 90% of the channel. But when we look a few miles away on the other side of the floodplain, there were levees in that area belonging to the same district, the Brevator district, and they survived 14 days of near consistent continuous overtopping without failing. So we looked at those things, and what we found was we looked at erosion rate versus shear stress. This is with Jean-Louis Briard at Texas A&M. I brought onto the team. It was a National Science Foundation funded project. And what we're seeing is the Brevator levees had clay in them. And you have more clay as you get farther and farther away from the active channel. And this is something we've started with since then. We've observed all over the nation. And so we have more cohesion and more resistance to velocity-induced erosion when we have more clay content. So one of the things we looked at with the committee was coming up when levees are taken out, like those that I showed you the pictures of, why don't we replace them with levees that are more survivable, that have a section that is designed to overtop occasionally, kind of like the unprotected spillways on NRCS erosion control detention structures. So we looked at a lot of different things here, including geomembranes and geotextiles and soil cement, and even looking at tainter gates on top of spillways, because we spend a lot of money putting these dikes back in. And federal law is so old, it goes back to around 1940. You have to put it in like it was before. You can't, like it was before had a low safety factor and it failed, but you have to put it back in. You can't benefit it by putting a gate in. If you put a hydraulic structure in here and put a gate in, it's gonna give you a lot better service down the road. The other vexing problem that we saw in the 2011 flood, which was a record flood on the lower Mississippi, was under seepage. And a lot of the under seepage is tied to channel migration. This actually shows just the channel migration in the last 200 years on the lower Mississippi. And that's what surprised us in 2011. Usually we see 98% of the levee failures are in private levee districts, not the Corps of Engineers work. 2011 was the exception. We had some major Corps of Engineers improvements like this one on the Meriwether-Cherokee revetment just downstream of Memphis, which had a huge failure that occurred and a big hole, scour hole that got gouged out. And that cost a lot of money to go back in and repair something that big. This is where we'd like to see about putting gated structures or putting overflow dike, capable dike in this area, that kind of thing. It's a lot of money. This is what it looked like on the aerial imagery. And what we found when we went in here and looked at everything was an absence of silt and clay. This is just all sand. We're seeing lots and lots of sand go through the system. So if we go back and we look at the Missouri River system, which is the longest river in North America, and it's 75%. It provides 75% of the sediment load that feeds into the lower Mississippi, or the middle Mississippi right here at St. Louis. And they started damming this at Fort Peck Dam in 1937. There's 9 great big dams on this channel. And what we've seen is a gradual lessening of the fine-grained sediment, the silt and the clay, which has the lower permeability. What we are getting a lot of is sand. The sand has been very constant and just keeps coming through. And each year it forms a larger percentage of what gets transported downstream. So we've seen a precipitous drop in suspended sediment load because of all those dams catching material between this is that curve there is 1958 to 68. It's much more precipitous now. It used to be about 700 to 850 million tons per year, and it's gone down to around 200 million. And when we actually had the USGS out in the channel on the middle Mississippi in 2008 and 2011 using Doppler bathymetry, and we're seeing huge sand waves with amplitude 6 feet high traveling down the bed of the channel right through St. Louis. And there is fine-grained sediment in the water, but nothing like what used to be there. So what we're thinking is there's increased permeability along the channels because the fine-grained material has been taken away. And that's just an aging effect that people didn't see back in the day when they built those dams. Our recommendation to the FEMA in 2013 was to drop their present system and go to a risk-based assessment of levees for the design of flood protection. That's what the Corps of Engineers had moved to post-Katrina. That's what the Bureau of Reclamation had moved to. FEMA was the only agency that didn't want to do it. They didn't want to make that change. And they finally lost that battle about 5 years later. So they didn't do what our report said, but they were forced to 5 years later to be more inconsistent with the rest of the country. Now, what risk-based assessment is, you look at all the different failure modes, and we've added 3 more since these 10 here were developed by the committee. There's a lot of different failure modes that we didn't see in the old days because they are tied to aging effects of the river system itself, like you heard Amanda talking about, and due to the hydraulic control structures that that people have put in. So this actually sums up, where we were in the old days. The 100-year levee was from 1968 on. That was developed actually as a standard by the Tennessee Valley Authority, just as a temporary placeholder back in the 1930s. It was the only example out there. So the federal and flood insurance program took that in 1969 and used that. And so it was a light on, light off. You either had a 100-year containment levee or you didn't. If it dropped to anything below 100, then everything over here was no longer in the flood protection system in the National Flood Insurance Program. And so what we wanted to go to was a risk-based premium. So even if you have a 50-year levee with increasing distance away from the high water, you would have some sort of risk-based premium that would be applied to you. They're still slowly moving towards implementing that nationally. That's going to take a long time to occur. But this is definitely a problem that each time we have a major flood, we're seeing records broken because the channels become less and less efficient. It was most hydraulically efficient back in the 1940s and 50s. And because of all the major flow events in 73, 93, 2011, the channel has become less hydraulically efficient. So that's all I have for my thumbnail sketch of what part of flood engineering I'm involved with, the policy side.